So guys, we have two more talks before the break, before the lunch break. And next, I would like to invite on stage one of the founders of 500 Startups, Marvin Liao. Marvin? Oh, you don't have a mic?
I'm actually not a founder, just a partner.
Oh, he's not a founder, just a partner.
Just need to get mic'd up, so.
Uh-huh, sure. So,
1 minute. Short break.
1 minute break. Everybody can talk to the person on their left or right side if they don't know them. You choose left or right. Get to know each other.
Yeah. We've got all the questions. I saw that there are lots of questions for these discussions, a lot of interest. And we'll send all the panelists your questions, and if they have time, they will answer. We'll publish it in a blog post on the conference blog. So thank you very much for being so active, asking questions. They're not lost.
All right.
Okay.
Hope so. Let's see. All right, sorry about that, AV issues. This is working. All right, great, awesome. Good morning, or it's afternoon, right? Good afternoon now. My name is Marvin. So I'm actually going to talk about growth. And just to clarify, not a founder of 500 Startups. I wish I was. I'm just a partner there, right? Just a partner there. So this is my established credibility slide. I'm a partner of 500 Startups. I'll talk about them a little bit more. I mentor also at about 20 different startup accelerators across the globe. I actually sit on a bunch of boards and advisory boards, mainly in the digital media and ad tech space and e-commerce. And I also spent about 10 and a half years at Yahoo. And before this, I actually spent 2 years, before Yahoo, I spent 2 years actually at an e-commerce company, raised about $50 million, and then proceeded to waste $50 million and learned a lot of lessons from that. And so 500 Startups, just if you guys don't know about 500 Startups, we are a global seed fund and accelerator, have probably close to 870 companies in our portfolio over the last 4.5 years. We have an accelerator program in San Francisco, which I actually run, as well as in Mountain View. And we are seed funds, so we make a lot of investments, usually in early stage companies, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the guy below this picture here, that's actually Dave McClure, he's a founding partner of 500 Startups, if you have never met him before. And why have we come into sort of existence? A firm like ours would have existed even like I would say 5-6 years ago because of big changes in the startup world. And a lot of these changes, I mentioned to you the previous startup, a company called Libris I actually worked at, was an early employee at. Half the money that we actually raised was actually to buy servers, right? And the other half was actually to go buy sort of like marketing, online and offline marketing. And these great platforms now, like Amazon Web Services, or Rackspace, PayPal, you have all this infrastructure that's in place now. You can rent and help you scale. On the other side, from the marketing side, you have amazing platforms like Facebook, Google AdWords, that allow you to reach billions of people very quickly, or even things like the App Store. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too. But yet, despite that, and if you haven't read this book, this is an awesome book by Ben Horowitz of Andreessen Horowitz, an awesome entrepreneur. The reality is that startups are hell, right? This is incredibly challenging time now. It's on one hand, it's easier to do a startup. On the other hand, it's actually really hard to do a startup because you have tons of companies in competition in the early stage, and lots of intelligence out there. So it's just being incredibly competitive right now. And just because you actually can do a startup doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a successful startup. And it's become much more challenging these days. And this sort of in line with what a lot of the other speakers in the panel said before. This is from Katerina Fake, who was the founder of Flickr, founder of another company called Hunch, which is sold to eBay. Is working on the right problem is more important than working hard. And I know lots of entrepreneurs by nature work very, very hard. My question, and we see lots and lots of companies, is that are you working on the right problem or working on something that you actually care about? And this is actually something we look for very, very carefully in companies we bring into our program and companies that we also invest in our VC fund. And I think one of the benefits, we talked about how it's easier and harder at the same time. There's a real startup methodology now. And this has actually been a big, big change over the last sort of couple of years. Eric Ries, which is actually his book Lean Startup, is based on Bob Dorff and Bob Dorff's customer development process, right? Bob Dorff as well as Steve Blank's customer development process. Things like little bets, this idea of bringing in scientific methodology into testing ideas before you actually build a product. These are all relatively new things, but a lot of this stuff did not exist before. And so there's actually great ways of thinking about how to build startups. And this is a huge, huge change. But one of the things that I think is really, really important, just because you experiment and do all these things, there's all these tools that are available. I think one of the big changes now, and I think one of the big differentiators as a startup founder is you really have to think about vision. And so, one of the companies I invested in, a company called Shots, and what really differentiated them is like it's a selfie app, right? And you're like, okay, well, big deal. What's lots and lots of selfie apps. What was actually different about these guys, besides the fact that they were just smart founders? What was different about them was that they realized if you're a teen, one of the hard things now is like bullying's a problem. One of the things of just sort of esteem is a problem, and positivity, lack of positivity is a big problem. And Shots, one of the fastest growing sort of apps around now, I think they did something like about 1 million downloads in 4.5 months. Not just because I invested, not just because of their traction, but because of the ultimate vision that they had. This is a selfie app that actually promoted like positivity. You're not allowed to comment, and there's no follower counts. And I think that was one of the reasons this app has grown so quickly, because of this vision that the founding team actually had of really helping sort of, in my opinion, fix a real problem in that demographic and generation. I think the other things you want to think about when you're looking at sort of doing a startup, or at least have a startup idea and executing it, is really this like language to market fit. And this isn't my idea. This is something I took from my friend James Currier, of just how you describe your product and think about your product. So there's an example of just like one great example that was shown was like for example, finding a date, or actually helping a friend find a date, right? Or sharing your photo versus sort of like hosting, or sort of like storing your photo. You have to describe your product in sort of the function, describe your product in the benefit that the end user actually has. And there's very, very clear distinctions in actually how you think about this. And one tip I give a lot of founding teams is that, for example, if you launch an app, the best way to figure out sort of how your product is being used is look at the reviews. For example, in the Apple App Store, look at the reviews of how customers are actually describing your product. Take that and wordsmith that to actually figure out what your language to market fit is. Because many times you can start and think, I think users are going to do this, and this is how they're going to use my product. At the end of the day, it's just a hypothesis, right? And the way that you're going to figure this out is actually watching how they use this and how they describe it. And this is actually one area that I think startups actually overlook a lot, right? And Paul Graham of Y Combinator, we mentioned, you hear a lot about probably one of the best accelerator programs on the planet, is the best accelerator program on the planet in my view. It's about doing things that don't scale. And where this is actually really important is understanding the stage that your startup is in. And based on that, that's actually how you get context, right? This term context comes up a lot, I think, in the last conversation, in the last sort of panel. When you think about context, it's about what stage is my startup in, and where do I get knowledge, sort of where are the mentors that actually get knowledge from doing this. I think too many people go and read these blogs, and they're helpful. I think that's one of the best things that's around. There's so much great knowledge, so many awesome books out there right now, but really understanding, okay, if I'm an early stage startup and have not figured out product to market fit, probably doesn't make sense for me to get sort of mentorship, and doesn't make sense for me to get advice and expertise or read books about a startup that's been around for 4 or 5 years and growing from 40 or 50 million users a month. That is probably not relevant especially in the growth side of like marketing and figuring out these tactics, probably doesn't make any sense versus maybe I should go and look at this company like 2-3 years earlier when we're in a very similar stage, right? And so you guys should have this slide, but think about like, are you in the traction stage, are you in the transition stage, are you in the growth stage? All the strategies of growing are very, very different. And also how you think about this, marketing versus growth. I think one of the previous speakers talked about growth, right? Of marketing versus sort of what they call growth hacking. Marketing is about buying your users, right? And that's actually the marketing side. And on the growth hacker side, it's like, where do you find them? And I'll talk more about this here. Let's see, next one. Next slide, not working. Yeah, here it is. Growth hacking, right? Have you guys seen these books before? A guy named Sean Ellis, he's probably the guy who coined the phrase growth hacking. He's a friend of mine, and this is a great book if you haven't actually read this. And what's interesting about this is growth hacking actually could only come from a place like Silicon Valley. And the reason for this is because a lot of startups, you don't have money, so you figure out ways of actually growing organically or virally, or actually building this into the product to grow organically and virally, right? And I think one of the things, if you think about this, is that what has made growth hacking so different is that you're actually reliant on actually building viral loops into your product. And that's actually unique, right? Think about these great companies like Dropbox, LinkedIn, Facebook, WhatsApp. These are all companies that grew with very little actual marketing spend. And not every single product can do that, right? Not every single product category can do that, but a lot of those tactics you can actually adopt for your startup yourself, all right? And I think this is, have you guys heard of the R metrics? This is actually created by my boss, Dave McClure, and it's a great way to look if you have a startup right now or you have an older company, a company that's been around. This framework is a great way to look at where you focus on finding, where you're actually going to focus on fixing your problems and where you focus on growing. So you look at acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, and referral. And I think too many companies focus just on the acquisition stage when you should be thinking about stickiness, as Devin mentioned earlier. The activation retention phase is like, great, you bring in these users, whether you buy them or sort of from viral loops, but like, how do you keep them on your product or service? And I think there's too many companies actually focus on the wrong thing. I did a project before my days at 500 Startups, there's this company that was spending close to, I think it's almost like $200,000 a month in advertising, right? This is a 4.5-year-old company. And what was happening was that they were just churning out users. And I was just like, I remember talking to the CEO, and I'm like, well, why are we spending money? Wouldn't it be better going to take that $200,000, $300,000 and actually put it into fixing the product, or at least going and putting the right metrics in place and understanding why these users are actually churning out, right? Like that would have been a much better use of your money, right? And much better use of your resources. And so anyways, this is an awesome, awesome framework. If you aren't using this right now, you should be using this to go and figure out where you should be focusing your company and your time and energy. And in some cases, like maybe acquisition is the right way to think about it. But in most cases, I actually think it's not acquisition. In most cases, it's actually the activation retention phase. That's actually way more critical in the early stage, in my opinion. And the reality is growth is a process, right? All these companies, LinkedIn, Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, they all have growth teams, right? And this is really, really, really hard. It's about making small bets, like figuring out what your hypothesis is, right? So you think like, I think our audience space is going to be these type of people. And I think when they come to our site, they're going to do these things. And it's about building sort of a good testing methodology in place to sort of see what is actually sticking, what isn't working, right? And the reality is that it's about doing a lot of experiments. And why this is really, really hard is because 9 out of the 10 experiments that you run are gonna have inconclusive results. But the whole point about this is by running a lot of these experiments and tests, you learn a lot about your user base, about your product. And this actually becomes a massive competitive advantage over most of your competitors. And the reality is that this is really, really difficult, because think about, I've talked to lots of startups where it's like, yeah, I did this A/B testing thing. I spent like, a month setting up this A/B test, right? And there were no results. So like, it's a waste of my time. It's like, that's actually not the case. 9 out of 10 of your tests that you run are not going to work. And that's actually okay. The whole point is a process that you put in place, that over time, these small little learnings that you have become big, massive competitive advantage and sustainable advantage over your competitors. Because this is so difficult, right? Like all these things we talk about, it sounds really simple, but they're really hard to do, and it takes time. And what a lot of people didn't realize, in Facebook, there was a period of time where, going back to my last framework, they spent a lot of time acquiring users, and they realized with so much churn, how do we build our viral loops? How do we retain our users better? They actually spent a year figuring out like the retention and acquisition piece, running lots and lots of tests before they figured out what the retention was and went, okay, now we can acquire new users, right? It took a year to figure that out. That's how hard this is. But now that's a massive competitive advantage for them, right? And now they're close to 1.4, 1.5 billion users across the globe, right? Think about that, because for every single user they bring in, they know the likelihood of them losing these users are very, very low, right? Okay, and I think one of the benefits as well too is platforms, right? I mentioned earlier, this has been a big change over the last like 4 or 5 years. There's tons of these platforms now that have over 1 billion users, or at least hundreds of millions of users that you can actually access potential users and bring into your product. And that's a huge change, right? And I think I'm particularly excited on, if you take a look on your sort of right side, like the messaging apps, these are gonna be the next big growth channels in my opinion. Particularly in e-commerce, I think it's very, very exciting. WhatsApp, WeChat, super, super interesting. And I think, but the one thing about this is that channels change over time, right? This is another slide I borrowed from my friend James. Think about like how quickly channels change, right? Everyone knows about Zynga, right? Zynga was a massive success probably about 3-4 years ago, but where most of their growth came from was from Facebook. But the problem was when Facebook changed their algorithm, all of a sudden you saw a big drop in their business, right? And so the reality is that most growth comes from 1 or 2 channels only. And it's your job through this rigorous growth testing methodology to figure out which channel works for you and your product. And so this is probably one of the most interesting slides I've seen recently, like about, the growth in Facebook, and now it's a challenge because of keeping up with everything. But I remember back like in the early 2000s, the big growth channel was actually Google AdWords. That's actually not the case anymore. Still a great tool, but that was actually where a lot of startups, particularly and a lot of e-commerce startups actually grew, which is actually on the back of actually, grew on the back of actually Google AdWords and Google SEO. And that's why there's this framework from a guy named Justin Mayers. He's actually a distribution hacker at 500 Startups. He actually wrote a book called Traction. If you haven't read it, it's an awesome, awesome book. But he talks about this Bullseye Framework, right? Where you focus a lot of your energy, whether it's budgets or your time, on sort of 1 or 2 of the highest sort of like, highest potential channels. And then you sort of, you basically, it's a methodology that basically Coca-Cola uses, right? They have the 70-20-10 methodology, right? You spend 70% of your time and money on the channels that you know will work very, very well for you. Then you spend 20% on sort of the next emerging channels, and you spend 10% on sort of big, sort of long-term channels that may or may not work, but that's your experimentation, right? And this way, you diversify your results, so you're not overly sort of focused and not overly sort of dependent just on 1 or 2 sort of channels. That's where you're gonna get your initial growth, but long-term, it's about scaling, right? And finding these other channels that will work for you. So this is one methodology. There's another methodology from a guy named Andrew Chen, another well-known sort of growth hacker, and he's also a mentor at 500 Startups, is what they call like the Barbell Framework, right? And these are 2 different frameworks. It's kind of up to you to sort of see what makes sense for you, but it's something to think about, and a way to think about new growth channels is that this was taken from, from financial sort of investing, right? So you have one side, you take half of your portfolio, what's money or time, and put it into very conservative investments, right? And so from finances, it'd be bonds, right? The likelihood of losing money on bonds, or at least losing all your money on bonds, is very, very low. So these are your growth channels that work very, very well for you. So in situations like this, could be Google AdWords, could be Facebook ads. And the other side, these are sort of, you put a whole bunch of your, in things like venture capital, or things like stock, which are a little bit riskier, but have higher sort of potential sort of ROI and returns. And this is the way you think about this. Could be new channels like WeChat, right? Or new channels like, I'm trying to think, like Instagram. Well, I'd say arguably Instagram is probably a sort of proven channel, or Pinterest. New areas that have high potential, but could actually, but are somewhat more risky, right? And this is actually how one other sort of methodology to think about new growth channels for your business. And the great thing about this now too is analytical tools. There's so many awesome analytical tools in place now for you to go and measure how you're actually running these tests. When I was starting off, must have been way back in '99 in the startup world, a lot of these tools you actually had to build yourself, and I had to bug engineers to go and build this stuff. Now you can actually go, things between tools like Optimize or Unbounce, Kissmetrics, Qualaroo, tons and tons of these products that you can actually use, now off the shelf as a startup for cheap, and actually put this and use this to measure how well you're doing as a business and how well your product is actually doing, which is very, very powerful. And like I said, this is also very recent, in the last 3 to 4 years, fairly new. And one, sort of my favorite law, how I live my life, how I look at businesses as well too, is Paretos Law. It's an 80-20 rule, right? 20% of your users are going to drive 80% of engagement. Same thing, 20% of your customers are going to drive 80% of the revenue in your business. If you can understand this, what your goal is to do is go and understand when you have initial usage in your product or initial customers, is to go and figure out who's my 20-80, right? And which 20%, how do I find more of these people? What are the characteristics of these 20% that drive 80% of usage, or 20% who give you 80% of your revenue? How do I find more of them? Where do they hang out? These help drive where you're actually going to grow, right? And if you want to take this even further, how do you find the 20% of the 20% that drive probably 40, 50% of your growth, or 40 or 50% of your revenue? This analytics is really, really powerful, and you should not ignore this. And so if you take anything away from this presentation, understand the 80-20 rule. It's going to change your life and change your business and how you look at your business. And last of all, in my opinion, culture and community really matters. And so 500 Startups, we have over 840 investments. We have something close to 1,200, 1,400 founders, have almost close to 280 mentors. This community, this growth mentality is really important of the how you think about growth in your community. For example, I'm very deeply interested in online marketing and growth hacking. And so I talk with a lot of other growth hackers, distribution people, online marketing, because there's a lot of knowledge. Everyone's trying out a lot of new things, and there's a lot of lessons. This is incredibly powerful, and this is how you learn very, very quickly in this area. And last of all, in my opinion, is balanced teams, right? To execute on this, you really need sort of what we call the hacker, the hipster, and the hustler, right? Hustler is a business person, hipster is design. Do not underestimate the importance of design in building your product and thinking about your product. And last of all is you need, and not an issue in this region, you have awesome tech talent, people who can build. And I think it's this combination that makes startups actually work well. I think we tend to have we do a lot of pattern recognition, right? Because we have so many companies coming through our program. I've seen 90 companies come through our program already, this year in Silicon Valley. We invest in, I see about anywhere between 15 to 30 companies a week that I look at for seed investments. We have a very, very big sample size, and we always find the best teams in general, the best businesses have this very, very balanced team. And at the end of the day, quoting sort of the immortal Paul Graham, is basically you have to make stuff people want, right? Because all these tactics and growth hacking, as wonderful as it is, online marketing, as wonderful as it is, if you are not building something that people want, all you're doing is spamming them. And so the reality is that figure out what people want, and that's why things like custom development process works, right? Things like lean startup. These are all basic things to help you figure out whether there's a market. All this growth stuff does, it just accelerate that. And so this is the last slide of my presentation. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this was helpful and interesting.
Hey, thanks. Thank you very much.